Hello, everybody. My name is INEZ. I am a singer, songwriter, musician, producer, and audio engineer. And today I'm super excited to present to you all a visual. Kind of peeling back how I mix hook vocals. For your listening experience, it's probably best that you use headphones. Because I'm going to be doing things that you may not be able to hear on your cell phone if that's where you're watching. So grab some headphones and we'll get into it. The song that I am playing for you all to kind of deconstruct is a song called Rise Up. It was a part of WYEP's Reimagination 7 project, and it features Na'Chelle Simone, a fellow Homewood songstress, who had asked me to be the producer for her song. So I produced the record, I vocal produced Na'Chelle, I was the recording engineer, and I mixed the song. So this is my little baby, Rise Up. As you can see, I'm in Logic on my MacBook. We were able to track her vocals pretty much with my interface and my MacBook. I do a lot of my recording on my MacBook. I recorded my entire album on my MacBook. So technology has come quite a bit in a short period of time. So to get into it, I want to just play a little bit of the record fully mixed, going in from the end of her first verse, and I'll play the hook, explain some things, and then I'll start to break it down for y'all. So here we go.
Realized I was sleeping on myself and then I woke up. I got off my ass and on my grind and then I glowed up. Tell me if you feel me, everybody put your phones up. If you was in some darkness in your life and then you rose up. Clouds in the sky, hanging in my past, hanging in my pain. I'ma rise above to every single name. I'm gonna rise up. I'm gonna rise up, rise up.
Yay! I love this song. So first things first, I think a lot of times when people hear a finished mix, they're like, that can't happen for me. This can absolutely happen for you. This song, the way I mixed it, it wasn't super intensive. And sometimes, you don't need, sometimes something that sounds super complicated really may not be. So there is a process that I think everyone should get in the habit of doing when they're starting mixing. And that is the order of operations. So the first thing I do once I have the stems or all the tracks is establishing what's the BPM of the song and what is the key of the song. These two things are super important because a lot of the after effects that we do are reliant on having the right BPM, specifically like delays. And we'll get into that in a little bit. And especially if you are recording your own vocals, always record to a click so that you're in time and you can tell when you're in time. So you're going to need to know the BPM of the song. Since I produced the record, I know it's 80 BPM and I know it's C major, so we're square. The second thing is before you even attempt to get the volume or anything else, you need to edit the tracks. Now, I listen thoroughly before I do anything. Before I even move a knob or a fader, I'm making sure that I'm cleaning things up. Now, there are people who are paid to set up sessions for mixing engineers, so they already go through and they clean up. What I mean by clean up is if you take a good look at the tracks, you'll see these little triangles here. And what those are fade marks. those are fades. Which includes breathing too. So the cleaning up means I usually take a tool and I cut and then I apply a fade. So I come down to the fade tool. Wherever I cut, I fade. Wherever the audio is about to re-enter, I fade. Done. So you do that across all your tracks, kind of the spaces. You don't want to go too overboard. Sometimes I lower the volume of breaths instead of taking them completely out, just because we all breathe. If you take out all the breaths, sometimes your tracks sound really lifeless and not natural, especially when you're talking about singing into a higher register. Like, sometimes you take a breath before you have to sing a big note. Like, that's just how it works. So yeah, I do that for all of my tracks. So if you look at this hook, I've already gone through and I've already cleaned up. The second thing I do is I label and I group. So if you listen to, let's put that back on the right channel. Cool. So if you listen to this grouping, you'll know it's the same part. So just to keep things like cool, calm, and collected when you're mixing, you want to group liked items. So I grouped those three together, so they're right next to each other, and also I grouped these background harmonies together. I'm gonna rise up. So I keep them close together. So when you're mixing, edit first, clean everything up, and then we label and we group. There's nothing worse than getting stems from people and you don't know what is what. So to be honest with you, before you're even doing any remotely fun thing, you need to make sure you're editing and grouping. So that takes some time. Take an hour before you're supposed to mix and just group everything together, edit, clean up, and then you can just move on to the next step. So once I clean up my fades, I'm grouping the like parts, I bus. Bussing is super important for the integrity of audio, and I'm going to explain why. So bus is exactly what you think it is. It's a routing of things. Like, sometimes you get on the bus by yourself and it's a solo trip, and sometimes you get on the bus with your friends and your family and you're all going to the same destination. So that's the same thing with mixing. So when we take a look at this hook, we notice a few things. So let me just make this a little bit bigger for y'all to see. So we have these three tracks together, soloed. We can unsolo those two. And you notice they're all going to the same bus. Because what? They're in the same group and they can go to the same bus. So they are going to bus 17. So if you could scroll all the way over, every session does not look this big. But you'll see bus 17. Boom. Busing is really important to make sure you're not overloading your master bus. When you think of how many tracks are actually in this session, just so you can all see, like, I have the instruments, all of that's here too. When you're thinking about all of these different elements, it's literally the same thing. Imagine if you're sending all of these people through the same door. It's going to be just like, someone's going to get hurt. It's just not a good thing. So we don't want to overload the bus because that causes distortion and it just sounds nasty. So we bus grouped, we send like signals to a bus, and then we send that bus to the stereo out or the master bus. So you can kind of see. I get in the clouds, in the sky, away. But furthermore, if we unselect everything and just play the whole thing, you'll see that this is not in the red. You should never be peaking. That means you're going to clip. It just means the audio is just, it's too intense. You need to pull some things back. And that's another thing we'll get into next. But as you can see, when I play everything, since I have everything bust out and broken out into special groups, it's not overloading the master bus and the signal doesn't sound distorted, which means you get some good stuff. Because it's very important that you do not overload the master bus, because there's a step after mixing called mastering, in which you want to create something called headroom. And ask any mastering engineer. They don't want to hear of super loud. They can do nothing with mastering if you don't leave enough space for them to master. And we can talk about that at the end as a bonus. So before we even So once everything is buzzed, I want to play for you all what everything sounded like, but without any special effects on it, so you can kind of hear the raw sauce we have to deal with before we start building up our next important step.
Higher than the clouds in the sky, our eyes. Higher than my past, higher than my pain. I'ma rise above till heaven sings my name. I'm gonna rise up. I'm gonna rise up, rise up.
So that's the raw vocal. Well, that's not really the raw vocal. I have a little auto tune on it, but we'll deal with that in another video. But yeah. So the first thing I always do, so it's the mix step order is edit, clean up, label group, and then the first thing I do is add an EQ. EQs are tone shapers, and you can go very wrong very quickly when you're dealing with EQ. So we're going to pull up the one that I have, and I'm going to do some like A, B, so you can hear what it sounds like with and without. Now, I didn't do anything super crazy to her lead vocal. EQing is about listening to your ears and finding the problem areas that you may need to dip out of the signal. So Na'Chelle, when I was recording her vocal, it sounds really good dry. So I didn't have to do too much. I know a lot of times when you're first starting out learning how to EQ, you do crazy stuff. So just kind of a quick like overview of the way these tone shape is. I'm going to save this one, but just for the sake of showing you all, I'm going to open up another EQ so you can kind of see. So this is the entire spectrum that we're able to see and hear. Now Logic has a really cool analyzer function, so you'll be able to see what her signals sound like. And then I'll explain the different parts of the EQ.
Higher than the clouds in the sky, our eyes. Higher than my past.
Okay, so each one is a band. So it starts low and then works all the way up to high. Typically I don't think we can hear. I think we meaning the older folk, as we age, we can hear less of this area, which is in kilohertz. So EQs go from 20 hertz. Once you get to 1K, it's you see the K there because it's kilohertz. So the first rule of EQ is sometimes when I'm watching my students mix, they're doing like wild stuff like this, and then no, please don't do that. EQ. All right, that's the default. So when you're talking about EQing, like I said, you want to cut first. So each one of these this is a shelf. These are the bells we use. So as you can see, like this is called the Q. So it's the width of your cut. So down is cutting, up is boosting. So we want to cut. Now you can change the width or the Q to be wide or to be very narrow. Typically when I'm coming in for my first EQ, because you can add more than one EQ, they just shape tone. So you can add a bunch of effects and still throw an EQ after it because you're shaping the tone of that signal.
Higher than my past, higher than my pain. I'ma rise above till heaven sings my name. I'm gonna rise up.
Right. So when you're cutting, you want to actually, there's something you do to boost first, but it's only to find the frequencies you want to cut. So we boost. You don't want to go too crazy. You don't have to go too far up, but you'll start to hear things that sound like tin cans or super rumbly. Those are the frequencies you want to kind of start to cut out. So we're going to sweep her voice to find some frequencies that we find undesirable.
Higher than the clouds in the sky, our eyes. Higher than my past, higher than my pain. I'ma rise above till heaven sings my name.
So that would be a frequency we could cut out. So we would dip that down, You dip it down. You don't want to go pretty much anytime over 6 dB for the first part. So when we found the frequency you want to cut, we just cut it and then widen it a little bit. Cut and widen. So there was some stuff over here. But that's literally what you should be doing. Now, since the human voice doesn't sit pretty much anywhere under 100 hertz, you can do a high pass filter on that. And that also will help if you have someone who keeps hitting the microphone stand.
Higher than the clouds in the sky.
So EQ on.
Higher than the clouds.
And since our vocal pretty much sounds good, what we have here works. So I just dipped out a wider band and I kept it pushing. And since this is on the bus, it applied it to all 3 of these vocals. So we have our EQ done. Now, moving on to compression. Compression is dynamics shaping. So Na'Chelle was pretty even with the way she sang her performance. So I threw a compressor on it.
Higher than the clouds in the sky, alright.
Now, quickly explaining a compressor. A compressor compresses everything over the threshold. So it affects anything, any signal that'll go over this threshold, it'll compress at a ratio of 1.38 to 1. So for every 1.38 decibels coming in, only 1 decibel is going out. So compressors work on a ratio system. When you're dealing with vocals, unless you're going for a parallel compressed sound, you do not typically want to go over 4 to 1 or 4 decibels in, 1 decibel out. The attack is how quickly the compressor responds to the vocal, and the rate and the release is how long it takes to disengage from the signal. So it's pretty much open and then how slow it goes back to its initial position. So like I said, her raw vocal sounded really good and clear, so I didn't go overboard with the compression. Compression is also something that can really squash the life out of a signal. So you want to be very, very careful when you're doing that. So quickly to back up a little bit, we edit, we label, we group, we clean up, we EQ, we compress, and then we listen again.
Higher than the clouds in the sky, I rise. Higher than my past, higher than my pain. I'ma rise above till heaven sings my name. I'm gonna rise up.
Sounds good, but I might hear some frequencies that I don't want or that I do want to boost. So then for this particular stack set, this is here for nothing because I didn't use it. Well, I can delete that then. Boom. Get it out of here. Cool. So I kept it really simple for that then, I guess. Wow. All right. Now, here's one thing. There's something called a de-esser. I am a person who, my voice is very sibilant, which pretty much just means my S's really sizzle, if you can hear that, Mike. And so your S's and your sh sounds typically tend to they can be very annoying. They can kind of overly brighten a vocal. So the last thing on your vocal chain should be a de-esser. Nothing should typically go after that. I say that because there may be some cool special effect that you want to do. But for Na'Chelle, I put a de-esser. There are differences between the male voice and the female voice. And so this particular plugin is from Waves. It's called a de-esser. And I typically just, when I'm working on a female or male vocalist, or esque vocal, this is what I'm using. So I used the female S default, and then you adjust it based on the vocalist. Now, this is also another area that people can overdo because a de-esser acts pretty much like an EQ, and it kind of cuts out frequencies that the S's lay, which can make your vocal sound super dead very quickly. So I'm going to play back with the de-esser and without. Actually, let's do it with an engaged and then without engaged.
Higher than the clouds in the sky, always.
So that's catching her S's. Without it, I know Na'Chelle has braces, so she's super sibilant. And we want to kind of cut that out. So I'll play it without the de-esser on.
Higher than the clouds in the sky, always.
So you can hear the clouds in the sky. Yeah. So that's why we have de-essers. De-essers are super awesome.
Higher than the clouds in the sky, always.
Yep. And that's pretty much it. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit because I want to kind of show you one very important thing that I did not touch on. So after I EQ, after I compress, I typically pan. So panning is where we place the audio in the spectrum. So you got to think of sound as left, right, center. So for this particular stack, I have one going up the center, one going to the right, and one going to the left. But I want to show you this stack over here with the background vocals so you can see. So it's kind of like, for me, it's math. Whether when you're panning and when you're touching the fader, you're really listening for where the frequencies sound the best together. Typically when you're panning, you want to keep things that have a lot of bass in directly straight up center. So I like to keep a lot of times my lower harmonies or my leads, I like to have them in the center, and I like to place the background harmonies around it. So if you look at these two stacks,
I'm gonna rise up. I'm gonna rise up, rise up.
and if you play it with the other ones, you can kind of see it's like a jigsaw puzzle. You're using, not only are you using the intensity of the fader to feel out where they feel really good, but you're also panning the signal or placing the signal in a way that it all works together. That's what mixing is really about. Mixing is about balance. So you're worried about your volumes being right, which is what compression helps with. You want to make sure you're placing things in the sound field in the right place, but you're also using like things like EQ to carve out space for everything to sit and to not sound like just mush. So that's really what mixing is. So we have our panned. So I want to play the stacks one more time for you before we move on, because the next hook, I had her add a bunch of harmonies, and then we can discuss the effects that I put on her song.
I'm gonna rise up. I'm gonna rise up, rise up.
And in context of the entire song for the hook, let's just undo that.
I'm gonna rise up. I'm gonna rise up, rise up.
So we have our editing done, our EQs done, our compressions done. We have our panning done. This is where I'm going to show you why all of these things matter. So we've created the space within the instrumentation, and we've added some really super pretty parts to this second hook. It's more of a compositional choice. When I'm working on background vocal arrangements, I like to keep the hooks simple at first and then add layers and add colors with vocals as I go. So we came up with some really dope harmonies for Na'Chelle. So I'm just going to solo this section so you can kind of hear how pretty this all sounds together.
Higher than the clouds in the sky, I rise. Higher than my past, higher than my pain. I'ma rise above till heaven sings my name. I'm gonna rise up. I'm gonna rise up, rise up.
Woo, I love that. I love it. I love it. So if we get in here, just adding on to what we've done, we see that we have high back. We have the 5 tracks that we started with. We've added mid-range harmonies. We've added soprano, and we've added alto. So I'm going to just get in here to kind of quickly show you where I panned everything. So the mids, like I said, the mids were lower. So I'm going to just play those for you really quickly so you can just kind of feel them out.
Guy, I rise. I get in my past, I get in my pain. Till heaven sings my name. Rise up.
And then the alto stacks that I have, which are more bassy, I love her tone on this part. It's just really incredible.
I'm gonna rise up.
So those are straight up the center channel. And then I had her accents panned hard left and hard right. Now, panning is really up to you. Is where you feel like they should be as far as harmonies go. I like to keep, since I have things grouped, I like to keep them. So if I'm panning hard left for one of the sopranos, the other soprano, I'll have panned hard right, which means all the way to the right. And it's really about building shapes within the sound spectrum. And I know that sounds crazy because, like, how do you build a shape with sound? It's possible. And panning is one of those really cool things that you can create shapes that really lend to what you've already done with shaping the tone with EQ and shaping the dynamics with a compressor. So just one more time, without the leads, this is what everything sounds like without the lead hook.
Guy, I rise. I get in my past, I get in my pain. Till heaven sings my name. I'm gonna rise up.
And then with everything,
I'm gonna rise up, rise up.
Now taking a big step back, the reason why everything you hear those delays or the echo you hear are because we took our buses. So if we just come back to the lead, we can come back to bus 17, which is where our leads are, and we see all these. You're like, wow, these are a lot. So just really quickly, bus 4, which is here, is a reverb plugin. Now, just because you see this plugin, you can use whatever reverb. You can use a stock reverb plugin, and find the chamber, because that's the type of reverb that I used on her vocal. And I send enough. I'm just gonna unmute these so you can kind of hear what just this sounds like by itself. So not only can you send, you can use buses to send groups of tracks, but you also use buses as auxiliary sends. Auxiliary sends send that bus signal to a new bus where an effect will be placed in that bus. So we sent all 3 of her lead vocals. We sent it to bus 4, and on bus 4 we have a reverb unit. So this is how you add reverb to your vocal. A lot of times when people are first starting out making music, they want to throw a reverb unit on the actual track. That is not good practice. It's very rarely done, or it's done for specific reasons, but you want to be sending your signal to a reverb bus. So this is the reverb type I sent. A lot of times when I first started producing music, I used to go way overboard on the reverb. Not so much. You want to pretty much turn it up so you can hear it and then dial it back. So just to exaggerate, so we are at -14. Just to exaggerate, I'll go all the way to 0 with this reverb.
I get in the clouds, in the sky, I rise.
And you kind of hear that distortion in there because it's an older model unit. It's supposed to sound like that. It's dirty vocal. That's the preset we have. So we hear it and I'm like, okay, but I'm going to put it back to where it feels good, which is 14.
Higher than the clouds in the sky, I rise.
So it's faint, but it's still there. And that's kind of how you want to you want to think about a lot of your effects. You don't want to go overboard. You just want to have them so where they feel good, they feel comfortable, and you can kind of get a little bit of them going. So bus 7 is our delay. Now I decided to use a tape delay. So the difference between a tape delay and a stereo delay is a stereo delay will fade relatively quickly. A tape delay kind of goes on for a while, which is also very important as to why you, for the most part, you want to make sure you know what BPM is, because then it would give you a more precise delay versus, an off time delay or a delay that may not fit the tempo of your song. But that's kind of the same premise. So I'm going to turn the delay on and you'll be able to hear what that bus 7 tape delay sounds like.
Higher than the clouds in the sky, I rise. Higher than my past, higher than my pain.
Right. So another really cool trick that I did for this tape delay is I put something called Mondo Mod after the tape delay. So the tape delay is going to go, but Mondo Mod is going to move it around the spectrum. So if you can see, it's going right to left. And then we have bus 19, which is another reverb. This is a plate reverb.
Higher than the clouds in the sky, I rise.
Bus 20 is a parallel compression that I used. So parallel compression just helps. It's called P-comp, and I was a little bit more aggressive with it. It's how you can sneak an additional copy of the signal and kind of make it thicker. I use the parallel compressor, but I also dipped out some EQ, so it wasn't getting too much in the way. And then we have bus 22, which has another delay on it. So this is the delay that you hear. It's a ping pong delay. It's a quarter note, which is like, you have the BPM synced. You don't have to worry about it. You can kind of set it and forget it. But the really cool thing about this one is it has a lo-fi function. So I'm going to just hit this. I'm going to mute the other tape delay.
Higher than the clouds in the sky, I rise.
So listen to that delay. If I take off lo-fi, which is a setting that this particular delay has, you'll hear it.
Higher than the clouds in the sky, I rise.
So that's full, but I don't want the delay copies to be so up front in my face. So I hit lo-fi, which pretty much acts like a filter, and it makes the feedback from the delay less noticeable. But it's still there. It sounds really good. And then we have channel 21, which is another reverb. And that's just a stock plugin. It's a vocal hall to kind of give it more make it sound a little more regal. And then we're finishing out with bus 9, which is one of my super secret tips. Is I like to shift signal all the way an octave lower, which pretty much just creates a bassy sound. So if I
higher than the clouds in the sky, I rise. Higher than my past, higher than my pain. I'ma rise above till heaven sings my name. I'm gonna rise.
So pretty much it takes the signal and shifts it down an octave, so you get like an extra octave. It just creates a really beautiful, like, deeper color for me. And the cool thing about buses is it's not just for one thing. Like, you can send any of these channels. Like, I can send the piano signal to any of these buses to add reverb or delay, And it's just really just building colors and certain this bus, which is the background harmony for the hook. We, like, if you see here, we both have channel 20, but I may have different amounts. We both have bus 19, but I'm sending I'm using 2 different reverb amounts, and that's really important, because there's certain things you don't want to overdo, and since I've EQ'd these 2 differently, which is another big thing, is I EQ parts based on how I want them to sound. I may want background harmonies to be a little more smoother or a little brighter. So it's not about dragging and dropping the same EQs on everything. Everything, even when you're applying it across a universal bus, like all of my background harmonies are going to the same bus, you want to make sure that you're creating that individual space for that element of the song. And I think that's really important about mixing. And yeah, so that's pretty much how I just did her hook vocals, using that methodology. You can do that with the instrumentation too. So remember, it's edit, label, group, EQ, compress, pan. You can actually, if you want to, you can pan before you EQ. Sometimes I do that. And then you add your effects. Finally, in closing, so we've gone through our steps. We edited, we've labeled, grouped, EQ, compressed, panned, added our effects. I just want everyone to know one really big important thing when you're mixing, especially when you're mixing something like a hook. The hook is the highest part of the song. So everything I showed you in relation to the vocals, but also you really want to focus when you're mixing, when you're EQing, when you're making these decisions, that you're listening to the entire mix together. You should not be just making choices. I soloed things to show you what I did, but as I mix, I'm listening in context. What I mean by that is I'm listening to, what does this vocal sound like on top of the snare drum? What does this vocal sound like on top of the piano? You want to be mixing with respect to the other elements. You don't want to just solo something and forget about everything else. Everything has to be in context, and that's what makes mixing sometimes difficult, is because you're trying to achieve a balance of everything. You see how big this session is. If I collapse everything, there's so many different moving parts, there's so many pieces. So when I'm mixing these vocals, I'm paying attention to all of it. So I'm going to play it in context so you can hear some of the decisions that I made. You'll catch some of the delays. You may not hear, and I know when people first start mixing, they get frustrated because they're like, well, I added a reverb unit but I can't really hear it over everything else. If you use the bus system, I promise you, when you go have your track mastered, that some of those nuances that you thought you can't hear, you'll be able to hear those. And we can talk about that in a little second.
Higher than the clouds in the sky, higher than my past, higher than my pain. I'ma rise above to heaven, sing my name. I'm gonna rise up. I'm gonna rise up, rise up.
Yeah, so mixing is really fun, and I know I crammed all this stuff in, and I know you're just like, I'm so overwhelmed. Take it step by step. I like to work on my songs in sections, and the reason why I focused solely on the hook, right, for this tutorial, was because the hook is the highest part of the song. It's the part that someone's going to remember. It's the part that you're going to walk away from this. You're going to be like, I'm going to rise up. You're going to remember that part. I guarantee it. There's a couple more things I want to show you all before we leave, and that is this bad boy right here. So when I'm playing all of the channels, this in Logic, in whatever DAW you're using, you'll be able to capture it, but -3 is a great amount of headroom to leave your mastering engineer. So while mixing is the balance of individual components, mastering is the universal level. So I will print this entire song to a wave and then pass it off to a mastering engineer who's going to adjust more with a fine-tooth comb everything. So they're not worried about individual parts. They're worried about the entire track as a whole, and bringing the volume up on it. They use a limiter. I know when you're working on your mix, you're like, it's not loud enough. That's okay, because the mastering engineer is going to polish the signal in entirety. So he's going to polish the track in entirety, excuse me. So it's really important that you leave headroom. I know when we want to listen to our mixes in our cars and on our phones, we want it to knock. But there's just certain things you want to kind of leave for mastering. Should you need to give a little boost of volume just for reference purposes, you can put a limiter, but do not go overboard. Louder is not better. Louder when you're talking about, you should never, ever, 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 ever print a song that's going to be distributed, say on iTunes, and put a limiter on that on your master channel. That's not how that works. You actually have to have your track mastered. But yeah, we're not even going to go into that because I don't want you guys to get in a good habit of that. And sometimes when you're working and you've worked on your mix, so when we send things to buses like the hooks, we still adjust the fader on that with respect to all the other elements in the song. Like I've got the strings here. I've got, the percussion loop. I've got the synth lead, the keys, everything else. And I'm adjusting these. And like I said, everything has a place. It's all about balance. And that's what the beauty of mixing is. That's where I have the most fun because I get to use my toolkit. There are definitely do's and don'ts of mixing, but the beautiful thing about it is once you learn what each tool does, once you learn what EQ does, because it's a tone shaper, you can come up here and see that, hey, Danielle has an EQ after her reverb because I'm creating space. I don't want my reverb to be too bright. I don't want it to be too dark. I can throw an EQ after a reverb or a delay or after a compressor. So once you learn, one of the greatest things my Berklee professors taught me was these things are tools. You don't screw in a screw with a saw. You use a screw gun or use a drill. So just be patient and realize that, yes, your ears can get fatigued because it's science. So if you feel like your mix isn't coming out how you want, take a break, take a rest, come back to it later. And sometimes I like listening to a record that I love. If there's a special effect, like, oh man, like that sounds really cool. I try to spend some time with some vocals and try to, I wonder how they did that. And as you go, each mix you do, you're going to get better. It's going to sound better. At least you should sound better. The internet can be so overwhelming with tools and tips and tricks. But once you learn the basics, once the basics are down, I promise you your mixes are going to start to sound really, really good. So yeah, this is Rise Up by Na'Chelle Simone. I hope you've learned something about how I mix hook vocals. You can apply it to pretty much any genre of music you want. Make sure your leads for your hooks are the most prominent, and then add all your colors underneath. And that's the most thing. The vocal should be the top part of your song. Hope you guys make some really, really awesome music, and I will see you all very, very soon.